So we're going to be taking a look at the useEffect hook. This one is very useful in a lot of situations, but it can be kind of tricky to get used to. So we're going to start off with a basic example and work our way up in complexity. So in our application here, I'm going to say useEffect, and I'm going to pass a function inside of it. And let's go ahead and import it up here. So the basic usage of useEffect is every time this component re-renders or is rendered, this function will get called. So we can see that if we add a console log here, we can say render. And now if we go over to our code, you can see it's rendered once. And as I type in this, it's going to render a bunch. Type in this, it's going to render even more. Now, everything on top of this is basically ways to get this to render less and to clean up after a render has happened. So if we want stuff to be called less, and by I don't mean render less, I mean for this function to be called less. So for example, what if I don't want this to be called on every render? I only want it to be called whenever I change the password. We can do it like so. We can say comma and then pass a array here, and we can say values.password. So now whenever I change the password, this render console log is going to fire off. So here, and initially it's going to fire off as well. So whenever I make a change, see render changes, but if I change the email, this does not change. So what did I just do? Well, the second parameter here is called the dependency array that you can pass in. And so here you can pass in all the values that your effect depends on. And so these values, whenever they change, the effect fires off again. And so that's the gist of it. And we can put more than one if we want to. In this case, we have only two values, but we could add another one here. Let's do first name. First name, values.firstname, and give that a save. And I can say values.password and values.email. So now my effect depends on the email and the password, but not the first name. And I need placeholders. So placeholder, first name. All right, so we see the functions getting called, functions now not getting called. Now the thing to note about this is doing a shallow comparison of the values, and whenever the values change, this is going to be recalled. Now by shallow comparison, I mean if we were to put something like this object here, the object is going to change on every single render, the reference anyway, or a new object is going to be created, so this is going to be called every single time. In a future video, we're going to cover how we can avoid such problems like this, and I'm also going to link to a video that I did about problems you may occur with useEffect with closures. It's more of an advanced topic that you may want to hit later on, and also a great article by Dan about useEffect. Alright, so that's that. The next thing to note about useEffect is you can kind of replace component did amount and component will unmount with this. So if we don't pass in any values to useEffect here, we can now have this console log once when it mounts, and that's it. So doing renders is not going to recall that function there. And I can do a cleanup function, which means we return that function from the inside of the function here. And this is called the cleanup function. Inside of here, we can add all our cleanup logic. And this is going to unmount. We can't really see this because it's going to happen when the component disappears. But if I were to create, say, another component here called hello.js, and in this component, if we toggled it, if we showed it and then didn't show it, we're going to see it unmount and remount each time. All right, so let's copy this over. Export const hello. And we're going to say div hello. And we can just say react.useEffect. And here I'm going to say hello. We're going to say show hello, set hello, set show hello. And we're going to say use state. And by default, we will show it. So here I'm going to wrap this and conditionally render hello. So show hello. And then we're going to toggle it on and off. And we're just going to negate it. So now we can see that this has rendered, and if I were to toggle it and it disappears, you'll notice the unmount's called. Toggle it on, you can see it render and unmount again. So we can see the component mounting and unmounting, and those two console logs go off, and we can see that happening. Now the cool thing about this is it doesn't just have to be when it mounts and unmounts. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we go back to our example over there, we can ignore hello again. By the way, if you don't know how to comment out blocks like I'm doing, this might be hard to follow. So command and then slash is how you do that. Probably control slash on Windows. So if we go back to our useEffect here, let's say I want this to fire off whenever values.email changes. Well, whenever values or the email changes, it's going to clean up. It's going to call this cleanup function. All right, so we render. I press A. You see it's going to unmount. We're not really unmounting. We're just cleaning up the old value, and then we have a new value here. So that's pretty cool. So that's pretty powerful that we can do that, not just on mount and unmount. We can do it whenever the dependencies change. We can clean up anything we need to with the old stuff. Okay, so these are kind of some basic examples and the basic fundamentals. Now I thought it would be good to show you some use cases of this and regular apps. So the first one I wanted to go over was with events. So for example, I may want to add event listener. So we're going to do mouse move. And this is a nice one because when this mounts, I want to start listening to the mouse. And basically what I want to do is just display the current location of the mouse. So I'm going to say const on mouse move. And just to start, I'm going to console log the event here. And so I can pass in on mouse move. And then I want to clean up this function when I'm done. I can say window.remove event listener mouse move on mouse move. So it's pretty nice that we can use this useEffect here, and we can have this when it first mounts, add it, and when it unmounts, clean it up by removing this. Another thing I haven't mentioned yet, but I guess I'll mention it after we show this real quick. So we can see as I move my mouse around, we can see all these console logs of the values updating. So effects are a great place to add event listeners and remove them. And I don't even think we need to worry about showing the value on the screen. This gives you the gist of it. But what I wanted to show you was you can have more than one useEffect on your component, and they fire off in order. All right, so this is going to be mount 1, and then mount 2. And again, you can have as many useEffects as you want. You can see 1, 2, they fire one after the other. All right, so the next one that I wanted to do is to fetch from an API. So the API I'm going to fetch from is the numbers API. And so I'm going to copy this URL. So here we just pass in a number, and this is going to give us access to a fact about that number. So we're going to create a custom hook for this. I'm going to call it the useFetch hook. I'm going to say export const useFetch. And what this is going to take is a URL. So I'm actually just going to paste this over here. And I'm going to get rid of some of this stuff. We don't really need these anymore. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to, whenever this URL changes, we want to fetch some data. So we're going to say useEffect. Dang it, we don't get auto-completion JavaScript for this. That's sad. All right, useEffect. So I'm going to add the URL as a dependency. So this function is going to be called whenever the URL changes. So here is where I'm going to call fetch, and I'm going to pass in the URL. Now this is going to usually, if I was writing this, I would make this asynchronous, but bam, we're already getting an ESLint warning here. It tells us that you need to return, oh, it's just telling you it's not exhaustive. I'm surprised this ESLint warning's coming up. And probably it shows a good example here. It says await there. Anyway, the point I was trying to make here is you can't put async right here in the function and use await. It doesn't like it, so we're not going to do it like that. We're just going to call fetch, and we can do .then. We could also have a function in here that we make asynchronous, and then you can call it like that. So it's up to you. You have those two choices of how you want to do it. I'm just going to do .then syntax. All right, so we're going to fetch from the URL, and I'm going to say x dot. Now, usually I would say x.json, but this particular API is .text, so .text, and we're going to say .then, and why don't we just console log y so we see that the value is actually what it is. And so I'm just going to call our hook real quick. So we're going to say const, and it doesn't return anything yet, so we're just going to say use fetch. We're going to pass in our URL. Dang it, there we go. So here we can see our fact getting logged out here. Nice. So let's make this more useful. So I want this to basically return to me the data and a true or false whether the data is loading, whether there's anything in the data. So how can we do that? Well, we can combine this with useState to store some information. So this is where you're going to see we can kind of use multiple hooks here in our custom hook. So I'm going to say set, I don't know what I want to call this. We'll just call it set data. So it's going to have data inside of here, which is going to be null by default, and loading, which is going to be false. And we're going to return, I guess maybe we want this to be true by default. And we're going to return data. This is kind of bad naming convention because data.data here, maybe I should call this state, and we'll call it set state. All right, so here we want to say set state, the data is equal to y, and loading is equal to false. And then at the very start here, I want to say set state, data is null, and loading is true. So at the beginning, we're going to set loading to true, and then we're going to fetch the result. When it comes in, we are going to say passing the data and loading is false. So now here I can display this. I can say, just do it at the top. You can say, if we're loading, we're going to say ... Otherwise, we're going to display the data. In this case, it's just going to be a string. And here we can see that displaying nicely there. And now the next thing that I want to do is I want this URL to change whenever or the data to change whenever this URL changes. So what I can do is I can add a little counter. So we can say count, set count, could start at 0, and we can say div count is equal to count. You could say increment. And so now we're going to get a new fact every time I increment the counter. So we can use the updater function here for our set counts. And then this is what's going to change. So now here is going to be the current count. All right, so 0 is the atomic number. We increment, we get a 1, and we can see it populate here. Now I think what's happening is you saw that there's like a little bit of a jitter. I think it's because we're displaying loading. So maybe we want to say if there's data, if there's not data, display loading. Otherwise that maybe get a little smoother. No, oh, you know, it resets the data every time right here. So maybe we can get this even smoother. We can say state.data. So if we currently have data, we can pass that in there. All right, so now we have a little bit smoother of transition, but there we go. Notice how every time I increment this, it looks like bad gateway 10. Looks like we hit a problem in the API. Maybe we're making too many requests. But either way, we've made 10 requests. Every time we increment the counter, it is going to update the state here, and it's passing that value to our useFetch, which is updating these values. So we're starting to see where this can be kind of fun and kind of useful with this. Now, a few things I wanted to note about this useFetch. First, let's say I didn't include this URL. Then this would not, be called every time the URL changes. But you'll notice we have this nice little warning from ESLint for us, the exhaustive dependencies, because it sees that we're using the URL here, but we didn't include it here. So you may notice that you're going to be getting that, and that's a nice little reminder to add those in here. The other thing is, you'll notice how I'm using set state here. I should probably add set state to the dependencies. So yes, you can add dependencies, functions as dependencies, and you probably should be. And again, that's where you have to be careful if the function is changing every time. The other thing to note is you can infinitely recur if, infinitely just call each other, is if you call set state here, and this triggers this to change. So you can just have it infinitely call each other, and the effect keeps getting calling. So you have to be very careful about that as well. So make sure your dependencies are not changing based on what the useEffect call is, at least not over and over. All right, so that is the useFetch. The next thing that I want to go over, last thing, is saving the state. So I found the hook very nice to do this is, for example, if I want to persist this to say local storage. So I can make a useEffect hook here. And so let's say I want to persist the value of count. So here I can say I want this function to be called every time the count changes. And I can say local storage dot set item. Dang it. There we go. Local storage. And here I can say key. I'm just going to call it count. And I'm going to say JSON.stringify the count in case I ever want to change the count to something else besides the number later for some reason. And yeah, it's as easy as that. So now every time the count changes, it's going to set the count in local storage. And now I can change the initial value of the count here by saying local storage.getItem count. And we can do a JSON.parse. And again, we just have a single value of count, but this algorithm would work for, say, objects and arrays as well, since we're using parse and stringify. Now, I don't want JSON parse and local storage.getItem to be called on every single render. So this is a good opportunity for us to use the initializer function of useState. All right, so let's see this in action and see if this works. So we're going to refresh here. I'm going to increment this to 3, and we do a refresh, and you notice the value of 3 is there. So again, every time I increment here, it is updating the count in local storage, and then when we reset or refresh, it is reading that value with this initializer function here. So there you go. That is kind of an introduction to useEffect and some of the things that you can do with it that are pretty useful. As you can see, it kind of has a little bit more flexibility than what you had with the class components, and it's kind of a new way to think about calling your data and combining these things together, and we can do all kinds of chained logic together, and we can have multiple useEffects. Because right now we have this useFetch or useFetch, which has useEffect in it, and then we have this other useEffect at the bottom here. We could also be, say, for example, caching data that we're getting from useFetch if we want to, and do all kinds of stuff.